Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our third session in special topics in evangelization and catechesis. My name is Marg Shea Lawrence. I'm the director for the Office for Evangelization and Catechesis. And I'm very glad that you've joined us here today from across Canada for this conversation that we are going to have with Archbishop Don Bolin. So our topic today is charting a path forward, the visit of Pope Francis and next steps in solidarity with Indigenous peoples. And so let us pray. This is a prayer of the Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. Who is it that comes forth like the dawn, as beautiful as the moon, as resplendent as the sun? O Blessed Virgin, Our Lady of Guadalupe, intercede for us with your Son, that we who live in this land, Indigenous and non-Indigenous together, may experience healing and reconciliation on a renewed journey for justice and peace for our children. Mother of the Church, pray for us. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. So today I'm very happy to have Archbishop Don Bolin join us. Don Bolin is the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Regina. He was born on Treaty 4 territory in Gravelbourg, Saskatchewan. After graduate studies and ordination to priesthood, he taught in the Religious Studies Department at Campion College at the University of Regina, and he engaged in parish ministry. In 2001, he was appointed to work at the Vatican's Pontifical Council for promoting Christian unity, serving the Catholic Church's international dialogues with Anglicans and Methodists. He was named Bishop of the Diocese of Saskatoon in 2010 and the Archbishop of Regina in 2016. Within the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops, he has been active in ecumenical and justice work. On both diocesan and national levels, he has been actively involved in Indigenous relations and responding to the calls of action of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. He was part of the Bishops' Working Group that worked on the Indigenous delegation to Rome in March 2022 and the Pope's visit to Canada in July 2022. Please join me in welcoming Archbishop Don Bolin.
Really great to be with all of you and very moved by how many people have signed up for this webinar. So the webinar is really going to deal with two major topics. The content of the apology that Pope Francis extended while the delegations visited him in Rome, and most particularly what he communicated during his addresses here in Canada. And secondly, I would call it the seeds of an action plan, which are present in the addresses that he gave. So I'm tag teaming here with Brandon, who's going to control the PowerPoint. And there we've got the title, and we can move to the next slide. So I want to speak first about the many expectations that were communicated to Pope Francis and communicated in the media, communicated to all of us in the church, leading up to the papal visit. And I've got 8 expectations that I heard from people in one way, shape, or form. And the first, and I think it's important to identify those expectations, and maybe at the end we can ask to what extent they were fulfilled. I would say that the expectations were wide and varied, and the difficult to fulfill everybody's expectations. But the first expectation, and I think the most fundamental one, was that the apology would acknowledge the depth of suffering and the different kinds of suffering that Indigenous people experienced in the context of residential schools. And that first bullet point really traces those children taken from their homes, separated from families, the suppression of Indigenous language and culture, worldview, and the various kinds of abuses that many children experienced, and how many died at residential schools. People looked for the Pope to take responsibility on behalf of the Church for the suffering that resulted in Catholic-operated schools, and acknowledge the trauma and intergenerational trauma experienced by so many First Nation, Métis, and Inuit children, and then the communities. And we can jump to the next slide here. That the Pope would express real lament and sorrow. I worked closely with a survivor from Saskatchewan here, Ted Cuisance, and with Chris Lafontaine, and we talked a good deal about, in the lead up to the apology, the anatomy of an apology. What did an apology need to do and say in order to move us forward? And this was a key here, that there was a real lament and sorrow that was expressed. There was many requests for the Pope to visit many different places and offer an apology there. That started in Saskatchewan, but Kamloops, Winnipeg, and other sites. And there was a push for him to visit a residential school site where there were unmarked graves, and preferably where ground penetrating radar had taken place. Many asked that the apology be connected to reparation, although that was defined in many different ways, and to some financial support or tangible commitment that the Church was really engaging with the past. Next slide. The request, really, the expectation that the Pope would be giving, as one survivor put it, giving the bishops marching orders, telling us, giving us some seeds, I guess, of an action plan, and that's what we'll be talking about in the second half of the visit, the second half of the talk. Chief Cadmus Delorme from Catechesis First Nation coined a phrase which I found very useful. He said, "The apology is really important, but more important still is the day after the apology. What's going to happen after the papal visit?" And lastly, there was a desire for the Pope to address the reality of colonization, if not in the specific details of the Indian Act, a recognition that the residential schools were, in some sense, an extension of a colonizing process, which took so much from Indigenous peoples, and that he would address the papal bulls, which are connected to what is often called the doctrine of discovery. Maybe we can move to the next slide. So while the papal visit was happening, there was a strong desire to evaluate and scrutinize every event. After the Pope's address in Catechesis, there was a great deal of commentary. What did it accomplish? What did it leave out? Why did the Pope not mention sexual abuse in that context when he identified forms of abuse? At each event, there was a deep scrutinizing, which was to be expected and understandable. But as we move into a post-visit period, I think it's important to deal with the visit as a whole. We have a body of texts from Pope Francis, and they were prepared together in some sense. And I think they need to be dealt with as a whole. So what we're going to look at and this is a presentation which isn't meant to be particularly exciting or dynamic, but to contain or to present to you the substantial content of what Pope Francis said in terms of apology and in terms of a way forward. So it's a little bit of a quote fest, but sharing the PowerPoint with you, I think, will give you a good summary and analysis of what the Pope said and how he moved us forward. Again, treating these texts as a whole unit. So maybe we can move to the next slide here. I'll identify 5 points in terms of the content of the apology. Firstly, in a very symbolic way, the Pope spoke to the children who didn't come home. When he arrived in Catechesis, the first thing he did was go to the grave site there. It wasn't a grave site where ground-penetrating radar work had been done, but it was a graveyard where it was understood that there were unmarked graves, and there were children from the residential school there at Erminskin that had died while in the school. One of the things that's not well known, and had to learn from part of the organizing team at Catechesis, was that Pope Francis went into the church before he came into the arbor and spoke. He went into the little church at Catechesis, and the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation had been invited inside and had the banner with the list of names of children who did not come home, a list with over 4,000 names, a list which is a little bit controversial in itself, but the Pope spent a fair bit of time praying there, and then with his wheelchair being wheeled around and blessing the names on the banner at each section of the banner, and then kissing the banner. A powerful way of acknowledging the many children who did not come home from the schools. Lastly, something that's pretty meaningful to us in Saskatchewan was that as part of the delegation to Rome, the First Nations delegation, a retired chief from here, Chief Marianne Daywalker-Peltier, from Okanese First Nation, maybe an hour from where I am now, just outside of Regina, presented the Pope with 2 small pairs of moccasins, very small children's moccasins. And they were intended as a symbol of the children who didn't come home. And it was a very tender moment in Rome as she held them out to the Pope. She, herself elderly, got up with some difficulty and walked towards the Pope. The Pope got up and walked towards her, and together they held these moccasins as she explained the significance of them. And she asked Pope Francis to bring those moccasins back with him to Canada with an apology to assist in the healing of First Nations communities. And so that's one of the first things that Pope Francis did at Catechesis. He acknowledged the moccasins right away, and then at the end of his address, he invited Chief Daywalker-Peltier up and gave her back the moccasins. And at present, she's discerning with elders and knowledge keepers what to do with those. But the Pope clearly wanted to acknowledge the children who didn't come home, and to pray and to stand in silence before that reality. Next slide. Okay, here we've got some longer quotes, and this first from Catechesis is really the Pope identifying what he heard from the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis delegates in Rome. I think back of the stories you told, how the policies of assimilation ended up systematically marginalizing the Indigenous peoples, how also through the system of residential schools, your languages and cultures were denigrated and suppressed, how children suffered physical, verbal, psychological, and spiritual abuse, how they were taken away from their homes at a young age, and how that indelibly affected relationships between parents and children, grandparents and grandchildren. So here the Pope is acknowledging the suffering of so many people in the context of residential schools. And if we go to the next slide, you'll see the core part of his apology. And I'll just give you 20 seconds here to read that. And now if we move to the next slide, at Quebec City, 3 days later, the Pope did address the sexual abuse that took place in residential schools, but also beyond. Here he's addressing more broadly clergy sexual abuse and saying, never again. I'd like once more to ask forgiveness. The pain and shame we feel must become an occasion for conversion. Never, never again. So over the course of the visit at each location, the Pope repeatedly acknowledged the experience of those who suffered in residential schools, an acknowledgement that was deeply desired from survivors. Okay, if we go to the next slide, next aspect, that an apology was extended on behalf of the church. And here there was really a concern with wording and a need to unpack the wording that Pope Francis used. Certainly a question that was raised in Indigenous communities was highlighted in the media after the Pope's apology in Rome and during his visit here, was whether the apology was only pointing to the sinful behavior of a few people or really taking responsibility on behalf of the church as an institution. So at Catechesis, the Pope introduces a key distinction here. Although Christian charity was not absent and there were many outstanding instances of devotion and care for children, the overall effects of the policies linked to the residential schools were catastrophic. Such an important sentence. First of all, the Pope acknowledges the good and the goodwill that was done by many people in the context of the schools, but sets that in the same sentence against a recognition that the system itself was catastrophic. And he goes on then to talk about the Catholic involvement in the system. So the text proceeds, what our Christian faith tells us is that this was a disastrous error, incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. It's painful to think of how the firm soil of values, language, and culture that made up the authentic identity of your peoples was eroded, and that you have continued to pay the price for this. So when he proceeded to speak of many Christians who were responsible for evil committed to Indigenous peoples, and he echoes that phrase, many Christians, several times, he made it clear that he was speaking not only of particular instances of abuse, but of all those who supported or were indifferent to the church's engagement in the system itself. This last quote is from the later that same day at Sacred Heart Church in Edmonton. It pains me to think that Catholics contributed to policies of assimilation and enfranchisement that inculcated a sense of inferiority, robbing communities and individuals of their cultural and spiritual identity, severing their roots and fostering prejudicial and discriminatory attitudes. And that this was also done in the name of an educational system that was supposedly Christian. So clearly it's the system itself and the Catholic Church's involvement in the system that he's apologizing for in the first instance. One last point in this regard. At Quebec City, the Pope met with members of the Jesuit community, and one of them asked how they were supposed to respond when they were asked why the Pope was apologizing on behalf of Christians, but not on behalf of the church as an institution. And his response was that when he speaks as Pope, he speaks automatically in the name of the church and not in his own name, unless he explicitly says, this is my opinion, I'm not speaking as Pope. So he was clearly intending to speak on behalf of the church. Maybe we can go to the next slide here. Many survivors and leaders in Indigenous communities wanted the Pope to address trauma. So in April, at the last day of the delegation's visit to Rome, when the Pope spoke, he speaks about trauma and intergenerational trauma. It's chilling to think of the determined efforts to instill a sense of inferiority. And you can read the quote, right? Unresolved traumas that have become intergenerational traumas. Now, when the Pope comes to Canada here. We can go to the next slide. In Catechesis, he talks about how his visit itself will evoke trauma. And this was something that we fed into the process because survivors here said the Pope needs to recognize that even though it's essential that he comes, his visit is going to bring about trauma. It's going to reawaken memories. And the Pope speaks to that eloquently. I realize that our meeting today can bring back old memories and hurts, and that many of you may feel uncomfortable even as I speak. And he would, I think, intend to say, even as I'm saying words that you're wanting to hear. And he talks about the past. I thank you for telling me about the heavy burdens that you still bear, for sharing with me those bitter memories. And if you can go to the next screen, he talks about what moving forward, and he's already giving us part of our action plan going forward here to assist survivors to experience healing from the traumas they suffered. And that last sentence on this slide, I am aware of the sufferings and traumas in different regions of the country. This is where he expressed regret that he wasn't able to get to, and he names Saskatchewan and Kamloops and Winnipeg. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. So the last component of the apology that I want to speak to, and it is probably the component that he comes back to most often, is in connecting the residential school system with colonization and policies of assimilation. So this was from April 1st in Rome. The chain that passed on knowledge and ways of life in union with the land was broken by a colonization that lacked respect for you, tore many of you from your vital milieu, and tried to conform you to another mentality. In this way, great harm was done to your identity and your culture. Many families were separated and great numbers of children fell victim to these attempts to impose a uniformity based on the notion that progress occurs through ideological colonization. Now we'll go to a series of slides that speak about colonization in the context of the papal visit. In Iqaluit, quoting from Exodus, honor your father and mother. That possibility did not exist for many of your families. And he goes on to speak of the terrible damage done when little children are separated from their parents. At Lac Sainte Anne, in this place where harmony and peace reign, this is in a context of a prayer, we present to you, God, the disharmony of our experiences, the terrible effects of colonization. And in that next little bit, a history of suffering and contempt, a colonizing mentality which does not heal easily. And then at Catechesis, it's necessary to remember how the policies of assimilation and enfranchisement, which also included the residential school system, were devastating for the peoples of these lands. And here, several people have tried to correct me and say it's disenfranchisement, but he's talking about that colonial attitude of enfranchising the colonizing powers and requiring Indigenous people, or trying to push Indigenous people towards an assimilation into European ways. Okay, we can move on. I think this is the last of the texts on colonization. Thinking about the process of healing and reconciliation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters, and this is such a culminating sentence. Never again can the Christian community allow itself to be infected by the idea that one culture is superior to others, or that it is legitimate to employ ways of coercing others. I'd say at this point, the Pope did not directly address the doctrine of discovery, the papal bulls from the early to mid 15th century, all the way to the early 16th century bulls, which gave moral justification to colonizing powers in language that's very difficult for us to hear today, and very difficult for Indigenous people to hear. The Holy See did indicate that they would be putting out a statement on the doctrine of discovery in the future. And there is consultation going on in that regard. And then, of course, on the plane, on the way back to Rome, the Pope answered a question about the doctrine of discovery by talking about a doctrine of colonization and how embedded that was in a European mentality, how difficult it was to break through that. And it was in that context that the Pope also acknowledged the genocidal character of much that happened in residential schools. So I think the next slide already moves us towards the second part of the presentation. Let me say in summary, in terms of what the Pope presented in terms of content of an apology, that, well, my friend Ted Cuisance would say every survivor would need to engage with what the Pope said on his own, that every survivor and every Indigenous community was at a different place in terms of a healing journey. The Pope didn't address every request, but the apology really covered a wide territory and covered a great deal of what was being asked for by Indigenous communities. The media picked up bits and pieces of the apology, but I think it's for us in this post-visit period to really be able to articulate clearly the depth and breadth of the apology that is offered. Now, towards an action plan, and sorry, I need to. Here we go. This was really a key quote because, of course, Call to Action 58 had stated clearly that apologies mark only a beginning on the pathway to reconciliation. The proof of their authenticity lies in putting words into action. So here we see the Pope really echoing that statement from the Call to Action number 58. Dear brothers and sisters, many of you and your representatives have stated that begging pardon is not the end of the matter. I fully agree. That is only the first step, the starting point, and talks about the need to be completely committed as church towards a future where we live in right relations with Indigenous peoples. So from here, I would like to identify, and now we can go to the next slide, 4 elements of that path forward that we see coming from the Pope's messages. And the first is a commitment to truth-telling and to telling history in a new way. So this first quote comes from the Pope in Rome, speaking to the delegations. Without historical memory and without a commitment to learning from past mistakes, problems remain unresolved and keep coming back. We can see this these days in the case of war. The memory of the past must never be sacrificed at the altar of alleged progress. Here I would add the Pope goes on to quote Elie Wiesel, the Jewish Holocaust survivor, and he's making that connection to the importance, the absolute importance of remembering the past so that we don't repeat it. And he goes on to say, in a fraternal spirit, I encourage the bishops and the Catholic community to continue taking steps toward the transparent search for truth and to foster healing and reconciliation. So if we go to the next slide, it was telling that the Pope would focus a great deal of attention here on being attentive to the past. This from a meeting with an Indigenous delegation in Quebec City. I have come as a pilgrim, despite my physical limitations, to take further steps forward with you and for you. I do this so that progress may be made in the search for truth, so that the processes of healing and reconciliation may continue, and so that seeds of hope can keep being sown for future generations, Indigenous and non-Indigenous alike, who desire to live together in harmony as brothers and sisters. I think the next quote I'm gonna hold, before we go back to that, to this next theme, I want to say a little more about truth telling. At Catechesis, he talked about a deeper investigation into the facts of what took place and making space for memory. I quote, "Here today, I'm with you to recall the past, to grieve with you, to bow our heads together in silence, and to pray before the graves." Now, for the church in Canada, following this path of truth-telling will entail many things, and I would just identify a couple of them. Ongoing historical research on the historical experience of Indigenous peoples at the time of colonization and in residential schools. It's a request that we're hearing from different First Nations communities. Let us access your archives in order to tell our story, to tell what happened at the residential school on our First Nation. And then assistance to First Nations and Inuit communities where there was a Catholic operated school. Again, specifically as they engage in archival work. And then the big work of education, working with Catholic schools, with ongoing adult education systems, with seminaries and places of ecclesial formation, in the preparation of curriculum and programs which really give an accurate account of the residential school legacy, of treaties, and of an understanding of intergenerational trauma. That's a major field of work as we seek to walk together in a good way. Okay, next. Many of the Indigenous people that I have walked with and worked with have called the churches and society as a whole to support the inherent rights of Indigenous peoples, rights articulated in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, rights which are given them by the Creator. And well, the question of Indigenous rights and injustice experienced by Indigenous people comes up in various places during the papal visit. It was at the Citadelle de Quebec that the Pope really focuses on this question in a strong way. And there are three slides here, long quotes, but this is such a powerful statement of solidarity and a summons to solidarity with Indigenous people. So he talks at the start about the systemic injustice in Canada, even in a country as developed and prosperous as Canada, which pays great attention to social assistance. There are many homeless persons who turn to churches and food banks to receive essential help in meeting their needs, which, lest we forget, are not only material. It's scandalous that the well-being generated by economic development does not benefit all the sectors of society. And here he talks about indices of poverty and other societal negative indicators, access to education, access to health. He doesn't speak of access to healthy drinking water, but in all those ways, Indigenous people are not experiencing equality in this country. Okay, so next slide. It's necessary in admitting our faults to work together to accomplish a goal that I know all of you share, to promote the legitimate rights of the Native populations and to favor processes of healing and reconciliation between them and the non-Indigenous people of the country. That's reflected in the commitment to respond in a fitting way to the appeals of the Commission for Truth and Reconciliation, as well as the concern to acknowledge the rights of Native peoples. So the Pope, I did what I didn't think he would do, which was specifically to refer back to the TRC's calls to action and summon the church to attend to those. And then the last part of this quotation, which turns us to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. I'll just let you read that. So the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples probably takes about 15 to 20 minutes to read. It's not a long text. It took decades to get through the United Nations. And it is really a roadmap for how to walk in solidarity with Indigenous peoples in their rightful pursuit of justice. Sometimes say that adhering to the UN Declaration, which the Church has done on an international level and on a national level. Adhering to the UN Declaration is a little bit like adhering to the Beatitudes. It's easy to say, but putting it into action when it gets down to support of self-determination, support of land rights and just settlements, support of language, culture, spirituality. It really is a roadmap for a different way of walking together. So the Pope points us to that. Okay, next, the third major seedbed here for moving forward and walking together in a good way is supporting Indigenous language and culture. A beautiful sentence from Catechesis. When the European colonists first arrived here, there was a great opportunity to bring about a fruitful encounter between cultures, traditions, and forms of spirituality. Yet for the most part, that did not happen. I think the Pope is also suggesting that today there is a possibility for that rich encounter with Indigenous cultures. And when we are invited as non-Indigenous into an experience of those cultures, ceremonies, traditions, there should be a real openness for us to accept and engage and be ready for that deep encounter. During the course of his visit, he spoke often about how wrong it was that Indigenous languages and cultures were suppressed. So here we read, "It's painful to think how the firm soil of values, language, and culture that made up the authentic identity of your peoples was eroded, and that you have continued to pay the price for this." And that kind of sentence was echoed on merely at each location of the visit. Okay, if we can go to the next slide. At Lac St. Anne, on the feast of Saints Anne and Joachim, he talks about it's good to read starting in the middle there. "I am struck by the vital role of women in Indigenous communities. They occupy a prominent place as blessed sources, not only of physical, but also of spiritual life. Part of the painful legacy we are now confronting stems from the fact that Indigenous grandmothers were prevented from passing on the faith in their own language and culture." So the Pope is nurturing us or pushing us towards a real respect for Indigenous language and culture. Now, I think there might be one more quote here. Okay, yeah, at the Citadel de Quebec, Indigenous peoples have much to teach us about care and protection for the family. Among them, from an early age, children learn to recognize right from wrong, to be truthful, to share, to correct mistakes, to begin anew, to comfort one another, and to be reconciled. Then in a delegation in Quebec City, in a world that tragically is often all too individualistic, how precious is your profoundly genuine sense of family and community. How important it is to cultivate properly the bond between young and old, and to maintain a healthy and harmonious relationship with all of creation. Go ahead. Okay, I've got one more little reflection before we move to this. In Iqaluit, the Pope reflected on how Inuit people have passed on from generation to generation, I quote, "such basic values as respect for the elderly, genuine fraternity, and care for the environment." And he encouraged the young people in Iqaluit to embrace and celebrate their culture, and I quote, "their beautiful Inuktitut language." And when Pope Francis returned to Rome, at the audience that he gave the Wednesday after returning to Rome, he spoke about how in his trip he had desired to reaffirm the Holy See's and the Catholic community's desire to promote Indigenous cultures with appropriate spiritual paths and with attention to the customs and languages of the peoples. So here a strong push for the Church to stand in solidarity today with efforts to strengthen or to recover Indigenous languages, traditions, and worldview. the last of the ways in which I think Pope Francis moves us towards an action plan has to do with the rich indigenous understanding of creation and of the created world. So there are some really sublime quotations here celebrating that indigenous worldview. I would just add as a preface that we expected this. Pope Francis in his pontificate has paid significant attention to the environment, care for the earth. And in all of the critical documents where he does that, he has highlighted indigenous attention to the environment. In Laudato Si, he celebrates indigenous communities, says they need to be our principal interlocutors. At the Synod on the Amazon, he highlights the indigenous care for ecosystems, recognizing that the earth is a generous support for life and has a maternal dimension that evokes our respect and love. So we expected when he came to Canada that he would speak of the richness of indigenous traditions. But at Catechesis, we start out here, and I'll let you take a few seconds to read this slide if you haven't already, and then we'll move to the next one. Quebec City, a constant concern of Indigenous people to protect the land and the environment. And if you go maybe 5 lines from the bottom there, we need to be able to look as Indigenous wisdom tradition teaches 7 generations ahead and not to our immediate convenience to the next elections, the support of this or that lobby. The values and teachings of Indigenous people are precious. I think the Pope has said in various contexts that for the sake of the world, for the sake of the earth, for the sake of the future, we need to start listening to and learning from Indigenous peoples and their love for creation, their care for creation, and their way of living on the land in a good, sustainable way. Okay, we can go to the next slide. In Iqaluit, again, a lovely, lovely text. Grateful for this opportunity to be here in Nunavut. I tried to imagine after our meeting in Rome, these vast places that you have inhabited from time immemorial and that others would consider inhospitable. You have come to love these places, to respect, cherish, and enhance them, passing on from generation to generation such basic values as respect for the elderly, genuine fraternity, and care for the environment. There is a beautiful and harmonious relationship between you and this land you inhabit because it too is strong and resilient and responds with brilliant light to the darkness that enshrouds it for most of the year. A very beautiful sentiments expressed there. Okay, and so I think that just to summarize that last piece, the Pope is really asking us as a society and as church to deeply engage with Indigenous understanding of creation and our relationship with creation, with our intrinsic interconnectedness with those who've gone before us, those who will come after, and with all other creatures, with the four-leggeds and the swimmers and the flyers and the crawlers. So, okay, now we're slowly working our way towards a conclusion in a few parts here. This is a powerful sentence here where the Pope speaks about his own visit, right? Gestures and visits can be important, and he's clearly talking about the papal visit. But most words and deeds of reconciliation take place at the local level in communities like this, and this is at Sacred Heart in Edmonton, where individuals and families travel side by side, day by day, to pray together, to help one another, to share life stories, common joys, and common struggles. This is what opens the door to the reconciling work of God. So he's saying a great deal of effort and energy has been put into the papal visit, but the work really happens in a most important way on local levels. And in the next slide, you get a little bit of an indication at Lac St. Anne of what he's calling us to. Let us ask ourselves, What do I do for those who need me? When looking at Indigenous people and thinking of their history and the pain they endured, what do I do? Do I merely listen with curiosity, horrified by what happened in the past, or do I do something concrete? Do I pray, meet, read, support them, let myself be touched by their stories? Looking at my own life, if I find myself suffering, do I listen to Jesus, who wants me to take me beyond the confines of my impatience, who invites me to start over again, to go a step further, to love? So we've got a clear invitation from the Pope to get into the weeds, to build relationships. So much of moving forward is based on the building of relationships, of solidarity, of compassion, of accompaniment, of appreciating the deep richness of Indigenous people, of walking together. Okay, next slide. So I could have included this in terms of the content of the apology, but of course the Pope was speaking to Catholics and non-Catholics. He was speaking to those who are faithful to Indigenous spiritual traditions. He was speaking to people with a wide range of worldviews, but he was speaking as Pope, as Catholic, and giving a Catholic understanding and interpretation of the suffering that was experienced in residential schools. So I think it's important, the theological language that he uses to describe that suffering. So praying at Lac Sainte Anne, we bring to you our weariness and struggles, the wounds of the violence suffered by our Indigenous brothers and sisters. Help us to be healed of our wounds. We know, Lord, that this requires effort, care, and concrete actions on our part, but we also know we cannot do this alone. And if we go to the next slide, we hear Paschal language in speaking of residential schools: to look together to Christ, to love betrayed and crucified for our sake, to look to Christ crucified in the many students of the residential schools. A pivotal sentence there where he's saying where God was present in the residential schools was fundamentally in the suffering of the students there. And then a powerful word about enculturation and what happens when we don't work with principles of enculturation, but instead try to assimilate. One cannot proclaim God in a way contrary to God himself. Yet, how many times has this happened in history? Well, God presents himself simply and quietly. We always have the temptation to impose him and to impose ourselves in his name. Brothers and sisters, in the name of Jesus, may this never happen again in the church. May Jesus be preached as he desires, in freedom and charity, in every crucified person whom we meet. May we see not a problem to be solved, but a brother or sister to be loved, the flesh of Christ to be loved. May the church, the body of Christ, be a living body of reconciliation. When Pope John Paul II visited Canada, he said, famously, Christ himself is Indian, is Indigenous. Here the Pope is really working with Matthew 25, whenever the least these sisters and brothers, where the least of these sisters and brothers of mine are present, so am I. So wherever people who are suffering are encountered, we encounter Christ himself. So strong summons to the church from a faith perspective, from a desire to serve Christ, to engage in building relations with Indigenous peoples. Okay. Last long quote here was part of a meditation in Quebec on the Emmaus story and on moving forward. So what happened? Why did it happen? How could it happen? Brothers and sisters, these are our own questions. They are the burning questions that this pilgrim church in Canada is asking with heartfelt sorrow on its difficult and demanding journey of healing and reconciliation. In confronting the scandal of evil and the body of Christ wounded in the flesh of our Indigenous brothers and sisters, we too have experienced deep dismay. We too feel the burden of failure. The gospel shows us, however, that it is precisely such situations of disappointment and grief when we're appalled by the violence of evil and shame for our sins, that the Lord comes to meet us and walks at our side. Brothers and sisters, the Lord also wants to do the same with each of us and with his church. So there was a profound word of encouragement to the church in the addresses in Quebec, with the Emmaus Gospel as the text that the Pope was fundamentally working from, saying that the risen Lord walks with forgiveness with us and summons us to go forward, and to go forward with courage and with commitment, and not letting the failures be the last word, and not being overwhelmed by the shame which leads to inaction. I was thinking in relation to what the Pope said, to famous words that are even on a t-shirt from Chief Cadmus here in Saskatchewan. None of us here today established residential schools. None of us signed the Indian Act. None of us authored the 60s scoop, but we have all inherited this, and it is our responsibility to do something about it. I think we hear the Pope summoning us in a similar way. Okay, now to the last little pieces of conclusion. The visit was carried out in the overarching framework of walking together, and the Pope identified that during the course of the visit to Rome. I wish to tell you that the Church stands beside you and wants to continue journeying with you. Dialogue is the key to knowledge and sharing, and the bishops of Canada have clearly stated their commitment to continue advancing together with you on a renewed, constructive, fruitful path where encounters and shared projects will be of great help. A couple more texts about walking together from the actual visit here, and I'll let you read this one quietly, and then we'll go to the last one. Again, the theme of walking together is about building relationships along the way. Finally, with the delegation of survivors in Quebec, the vastness of this land makes us think of the lengthy path of healing and reconciliation that we are facing together. The phrase that has accompanied us when the Indigenous delegates came to visit me in Rome and inspires my visit here among you is walking together, marcher ensemble. And the last little bit was a story that Cardinal Lacroix told us. It's not on the internet, I don't think, or written down anywhere, but before Pope Francis left the Basilica in Quebec City, Cardinal Lacroix asked him to write something in the visitor's book. And so he wrote in French, marcher ensemble, ce n'est pas facile, mais c'est possible. It's not easy to walk together, but it is possible. So I think we can end the PowerPoint here, and I'll just offer a couple last words. I think that the papal visit really transformed the situation, the relationship with Indigenous people, that there's a new opportunity open for us today. But it is really for us to carry, to move the visit forward towards action. And I think the interpretation of the visit, the broad understanding of what Pope Francis offered us and acting on it, that's critical for the present moment. For that reason, I'm profoundly grateful that 200 of you are here today taking part in this conversation about how we move forward. Okay, with that, I will pass it over to
Archbishop. Thank you so much. You have given us a great gift this afternoon. I think all of us would have been eagerly watching and listening to the papal visit and what was being said. But what you did for us, and many of the participants mentioned that in their comments, was that you contextualized it as a whole. So we weren't hearing just the sound bites that the media would pick up and people would react to. We got a sense of what the Pope was trying to do as he worked his way through the country. And I think for us as individuals working in ministry. That's a great gift to be able to draw that together, and thank you for doing that. So let's look at what some participants have asked. As we were getting the questions, I was trying to prioritize them, but I think I'm just going to work through them. There are questions that are all about some of the things happening right now that we can look at the beginning. How can we justify the Mental Health Association suddenly pulling the plug on shelters this winter for Indigenous peoples? Is that something that is taking us a step back from what we've been trying to do?
Yeah, well, I think this is an opportunity for the church to get into particular issues, to stand in solidarity with Indigenous people, to accompany them in their rightful request for justice. And here in Regina, we have a homeless village, and it's for society as a whole to engage, but for the churches to listen to Indigenous people, to allow Indigenous people to take the lead. That's critical. We have to move away from models where non-Indigenous tell Indigenous peoples what they really need. But to really stand in solidarity and to put our efforts and our resources behind that solidarity.
One of the early questions was when you mentioned the controversy about the banner and the moccasins, and they were confused as to what the controversy was. Was it the banner, or was it the moccasins? Was it the presentation itself? What can you address that just a little?
I didn't hear any controversy around the moccasins themselves.
That was the banner.
The National Center for Truth and Reconciliation has prepared a banner with the names of those children who died and who were missing. And so there's a little bit of controversy swirling in historical circles about those names. I think the Pope set the controversy aside, and his blessing of and kissing the banner was a way of humbly acknowledging and standing in sorrow before the reality that so many children died in the context of those residential schools. There's one in 25, I believe. And of course, the unmarked graves and the ground penetrating work has awoken Canadian society to something which was there before us all along. The Truth and Reconciliation process talks about it very directly. So I think
I don't remember.
The Pope works us through that controversy and says, let's stay focused here on let's stand in sorrow before that reality.
And I don't remember the moccasin piece being promoted or discussed, but it's such a beautiful full circle when you see that he brings them back, and it's a beautiful story. This next is more of not a question, but a statement to ask if you knew about this. But were you aware of the program in the Diocese of Peterborough, offered in collaboration with First People's House of Learning at Trent University? This participant attended a new history lesson, and the thoughts were that it should be shared with more people. It was offered to the clergy in a session for the laity, and an intergenerational explanation of truth-telling. Are you aware of that or other programs, some similar happening?
I'm not aware of that particular program, but I'm glad to hear of it. I mean, I think across the country, work is being done, especially in the context of schools, where curriculum is being produced in Catholic and public schools, which really listens deeply to the experience of Indigenous peoples and the struggles associated with residential schools. But I think also of the Kairos blanket exercise that many people have had the opportunity to participate in, which is a simple way of awakening us to white privilege, to seeing history from another side, from the side of those who were displaced and marginalized, and learning from that, and therefore being ready to make changes as a result of it. I think that truth-telling, that task of truth-telling, goes very deep. When I grew up, I really, I had some sense every once in a while somebody at school would bring an arrowhead, but I had no sense of the deep history of Indigenous people on the land. I told the story of Saskatchewan starting with my great-grandparents in the 1880s. I had the chance to walk go on a long prairie walk with, among others, an anthropologist. And I said, what's the earliest trace of Indigenous settlement in what is now Saskatchewan? And he said dates to 10,000 years ago, which I wasn't surprised by at that point. But the location was half-hour from the farm where I grew up. And yet I had no recognition or sense of that history. And I think that's pretty much a generational reality. There is such a learning and an unlearning that is needed.
Very much so. And a number of people asked that there seemed to be so little Indigenous spirituality in the masses held in Canada. Was there a reason for that, or what's the intentionality behind that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a good question, and I'm not well situated to answer that. But the Pope certainly urges us towards a deep encounter with Indigenous spiritual traditions, and especially with an Indigenous worldview, which he sees as so necessary and helpful for the world. And of course, he points to the 7 wisdom teachings, grandfather teachings of the Anishinaabe in one of his addresses. He points to aspects of Indigenous spirituality which also resonate profoundly with Christian spirituality. Yeah, I wasn't involved in that liturgical.
Right.
I know there was a great deal of focus on that.
Another moving forward question: land acknowledgements are becoming more prevalent, more used more often in many locations. And the question was, as we move forward, do you have any suggestions on what can be used, or are there any common ways that are suggestions for what we should do in our Catholic settings, meetings, study spaces, etc., that would encourage this?
Right. I think it's a couple of points. I mean, first of all, many Indigenous leaders are telling us that it's really important and they really appreciate when we do land acknowledgements. Secondly, it's important to consult with Indigenous people in each local region to find out how best to make those land acknowledgements, because they're specific to particular regions. This is Treaty 4 territory, the land of the Nahiwak, the Nakaway, the Nakota, traditional territories of the Dakota, Lakota, and Métis peoples. It's it's important to know in your area how to make a proper land acknowledgement. But Indigenous leaders are also telling us, don't quit with the land acknowledgement. It's not a tick of a box, right? It's a recognition of a history and a treaty relationship and a summons to walking together. In terms of land acknowledgements in ecclesial settings, I think there's in the churches here, some of our parishes in Regina have a land acknowledgement before Mass begins. Others don't. I think it's something to be discerned locally.
And I think there has to be a depth of discernment so that it doesn't just become a tick box that, yes, we've done it and we're not moving on from that.
I agree. And there's context where it's more appropriate and context where it's less appropriate. So
the question as to whether you've spoken to Indigenous people since the apology, and what's their sense of feeling of hopefulness for participation in the Truth and Reconciliation as it moves forward.
Right.
And unpacking.
Right. Well, a wide range of reactions from Indigenous people that I've walked with and spoken with. For many, and I could hear some of those voices of chiefs coming up to tell the Pope they accepted his apology and were ready to move forward. Experience in Iqaluit was very powerful in that regard. Others saying they didn't want that apology, they didn't need that apology, or that it didn't say all the things that they needed it to say or wanted it to say. So I think Ted Cuisance was very right in saying each survivor and each Indigenous community has to engage with this in their own way. but I think we have seen a consistent response, basically saying apologies are a starting point. What is vital is the day after the apology.
I love that quote. It's powerful. This next question is for you, but it's through you to the CCCB, and I think it'll have an effect for Marg as well. After such a moving visit, after this pilgrimage, are there structures being increased? What resources will the CCCB and local churches put in place in service of Indigenous reconciliation, and perhaps new ecumenical engagements with other leaders for a similar path? Is it going to give us a new vision as the church in Canada as we move forward?
I think so, on various levels. I think in the CCCB, we're engaging into discernment about our structures for moving forward in Indigenous relations. There is the Canadian Catholic Indigenous Council, and there is the Guadalupe Circle. There are other structures for engagement with Indigenous peoples in preparation for the delegation to Rome. Bishops' Working Group was established, which carried out a lot of the work, also connecting to the papal visit. But we're asking now, how do we best structure in a way which really listens deeply to Indigenous elders, knowledge keepers, survivors? How do we maintain dialogue with national Indigenous organizations, dialogues which were not there before preparation for the visit to Rome, and now where there is a relationship? How do we build on those and move forward on those on a national level? How do we engage with the National Circle for Survivors? But there's also the discernment about what needs to happen locally. And I think the CCCB's hope is that in every diocese and eparchy, every bishop is going back saying, okay, now we've had the papal visit. How do we move forward? And most dioceses across the country have made a financial commitment to healing and reconciliation. So how do we do that in a good way? How do we do that in a way that builds relationship, that strengthens community, that models walking together in a good way, rightful, just relationships? So that work really comes back home to each of us. And I would think also on the parish level, especially where parishes are located not far from First Nations or Métis or Inuit communities, or where there are significant encounters. There's a possibility for relationship building and finding good ways of walking together in each of those contexts.
I love that image, and I think it does offer us opportunities of walking together, and we can look at it with guidance from the national level all the way down to the parish level, and each community would find ways and inroads within their own community to do that. But I think we'll see an increase of that with resources coming out from CCCB and other agencies as well. Bishop, I'm going to turn it back over to Marg now, just before we go, but thank you again for the in-depth presentation that you gave us today. Marg.
Thank you very much, David. You're the great facilitator of Q&A. At this time, I'll invite Michelle Dabrowski, my colleague, the Director of the Office for Family and Life, to bring greetings to Archbishop Boland.
Yes, and I have the honor and the privilege to say a thank you, a sincere and deep thank you for the presentation today, Archbishop Boland. I think many of us on the call today, it was important that we take this time to hear your words, but I really love the way you brought the visit and the apology of Pope Francis to us in a very tangible way, and you broke it down and you made it so relatable to us in our context, looking at what he communicated with the visit as a whole, but also what are those seeds for an action plan. And I love that we have some concrete, pragmatic, practical tools that we can bring into our local settings. I also just noting on two things about how you synthesize the expectations before the papal visit, those 8 expectations. I think this is really a rich gift to us that we can go back and work through. And then looking at this corpus of text, and it's really, I think, a gift to the church in Canada. And it inspires us to go and read those texts, to spend time with them. And just the beauty and the richness that is within them that will lead us to action. And I think for many people on the call today, we have many educators, catechists, people who are working in the local dioceses and parishes. And I think this note about truth telling and commitment to telling truth and history in a new way, this is going to speak to many people. Yes, and those the last point too. One of the quotes you pulled, what opens the door to the reconciling work of God, to pray together, to help one another, to share life stories, common joys and struggles. A beautiful call to action for each one of us in our local settings. And I think so many of these key moments that we can rewatch this later, and to continue to feel a motivation forward in this process of healing and reconciliation with Indigenous peoples and non-Indigenous peoples. So thank you for your leadership, your dedication, your commitment, and your authenticity. It is really a real gift to us today. So thank you from the bottom of our hearts.
Thank you very much, Michelle. And I echo Michelle's sentiments, Bishop. It is indeed the day after the apology, and we are therefore called to action. And I really believe that you've inspired us as well today to that action. I loved the way that you put the messages of Pope Francis in the continuity between the messages, because I do think we have to hear the message in its entirety from Rome to Iqaluit. So I'm really grateful for your time today as well. So thank you very much. At this time, Brandon, we'll just move on to some housekeeping details. Next week, we will have picking up on one of the last points of Archbishop Bolin, the question of creation. Next week we will have Father John McCarthy, Jesuit, creation as a source of life and our call to care for it. Father McCarthy is a well-known scientist. He's a Jesuit father, a theologian who really understands this question of our call to care for creation. So I hope you'll join us next week as well. I'll just mention a couple of resources. The CCCB has published a book, a diocesan parish or school resource. It's called Walking Together, Pope Francis, Canada, 24 to 29, July 2022. And it contains all of the texts of the Holy Father's interventions here in Canada. So I really encourage you. It's available at the CCCB publications if you're interested in it. It's in French and English, so it's a very complete resource. So I'm hoping that you'll take a look at that, and just some other resources that are available for you as well. Brandon, we'll just move to the next slide there. I mentioned the prayer today was taken from Our Lady of Guadalupe Circle. It is a partnership of people interested in questions related to Indigenous peoples and healing and reconciliation. So there's their website. And then on the CCCB website, we have a number of resources as well that you might be interested in. So I just encourage you to have a look at those as well. Anyway, thank you very much for joining us today. We'll see you next week. And I wish you all a very good week, and we will remember on Friday those men and women who gave their lives in sacrifice for our own freedom, and pray for them. God bless. See you next week. Bye-bye.